Okay, so I'm very pleased to have Daisy Buzzoni speaking to us tonight. She's a PhD candidate at Uvic in Dr. Julia Baum's lab. Daisy recently completed her master's degree in Florida at the University of Miami. And now she's at Uvic investigating the effects of local disturbance on coral symbioses in a warming ocean. And as you can see from the title, it should be a good one about coral reefs. So with that, I'll hand it over to Daisy.
Thank you so much, Phil. And feel free to record if you were going to record this.
Yeah.
It's hard to remember that at the beginning. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Well, yeah, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all so much for coming to yet another Zoom call. And thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to meet so many local nature and wildlife enthusiasts. So I'll start with a bit of background on how and why I got involved in coral research and some of the most interesting, in my opinion, aspects of coral biology. Then we'll move on to some of the problems that the world's coral reefs face, and that'll lead us into some of these incredibly creative intervention strategies being trialed to try and secure their future. Feel free at any point to chime in with questions, and I'll try and monitor the chat as well, but no promises there. But I will absolutely be around at the end for questions.
I can monitor the chat. So.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. So the keen-eared among you might have noticed that I am from the UK. So you might quite reasonably ask, how did I get involved with researching corals, which are located along this, this tropical belt shown here in Burgundy. So when I was about 13 or 14, I was lucky enough to learn how to scuba dive. And here I am diving in Miami, where I had a position before I came here to Victoria. And as soon as I started scuba diving, I just became fascinated with marine life, and especially the plethora of these weird little critters that occupy the sea floor. And now I'm lucky enough to scuba dive for work, to conduct research on corals, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So when I started scuba diving, I first heard of corals as these rock-like structures on the seafloor with these kind of cute and kitschy names that were indicative of their shapes, such as brain corals, shown here. Another one of my favorites, the pineapple coral, and these magnificent branching structures of elkhorn coral. So I started to hear these names, but I still wasn't really sure what a coral actually was. You know, was it a rock? Was it a plant? Was it an animal? And it turns out they're a bit of all three. So the more I learned about coral biology, the more interested I became. So corals are actually animals and very closely related to jellyfish. They form these colonies, with each of these structures being a polyp with a little mouth in the middle. So that's our animal part of the equation. But inside of them, they also host these single-celled algae that photosynthesize, so using the sun's energy as plants do to provide the coral with food. So we've got our plant, we've got our animal. But unlike jellyfish, corals actually secrete a skeleton. So the living part of a coral is this really thin veneer of living tissue on top of the limestone skeleton that forms these amazing intricate structures that we see on coral reefs. And these structures grow incredibly slowly, depending on the species, somewhere around 1 to 2 centimeters a year. And as well as creating these amazing structures, these coral skeletons are really useful for scientists because they can tell us about the ocean's history. So, for example, this is the world's largest and oldest known coral, affectionately known as Big Mama from American Samoa. And by taking these cores through the coral skeleton, scientists can use techniques similar to counting tree rings or even use carbon dating. And that can tell us a huge amount about the history of the ocean. And from that, they've worked out that this coral is around 500 years old. So granted, the general pace of life of a coral is fairly slow, but nevertheless, they do have some quite dramatic behaviors. So to supplement the food that they receive from those photosynthetic algae, they also themselves feed on plankton in the water column using this sticky mucus and using their tentacles, which I've got a short video of here. So you can see here the coral using its tentacles to pull in these strings of mucus that plankton have become attached to. So another quite dramatic behavior that we see in corals is aggression. So here we see a brain coral and here a competing species with this dead zone in between them. And that's a result of aggression between these two species. So what happens here is a coral will actually spit out the equivalent of its intestines, its digestive filaments, and try and digest its neighbors, which one of my previous supervisors poetically called chucking their guts at each other. So they're doing this to try and digest competitors to reclaim space on the seafloor. So the last coral behavior that I wanted to talk about is probably the most dramatic and definitely the most beautiful, in my opinion. So corals do reproduce sexually, and they do this en masse by coordinating largely through the light of the full moon. And what they'll do is release these pink bundles of eggs and sperm that will then form these slicks on the surface of the ocean, and sperm fertilizes egg to form these larvae that will then settle on the sea floor and grow into coral colonies. So I started out studying corals because I found all of these aspects of their biology just so fascinating. And the more I learned, the more interested I became. But the more I learned about them, the more I learned about the threats that face them and their critical importance for people all over the world. And now that is really what motivates me to carry on studying them. So in terms of their importance, obviously they create this structure. They are the basis, really, of an entire reef ecosystem, because by creating this 3D structure, they create habitat for fish to live in, like these small fish shown here, which then feed bigger fish, and a whole ecosystem is created and supported. And obviously that's important, not just for its intrinsic beauty and interest, but it supports huge fish populations the world over. But actually, perhaps the biggest economic contribution that we gain from coral reefs is their role in protecting our coastlines. So when these large oceanic pelagic waves come towards a coastline, a coral reef will absorb about 90% of that wave's energy, effectively causing the wave to break over the reef. And this absorbs a huge amount of the wave's energy and protects our coastlines from flooding. So this protection is estimated to save the United States about $94 million a year in flood damage. And that's for the US. So really, we're talking about Hawaii and southern Florida. And when we look at a country like Indonesia, an island nation, that saving from coastal protection is upwards of about $600 million a year. And this is where one of the biggest social issues surrounding coral reef conservation comes in, this idea of coastline protection. So as the climate is changing, we're seeing sea levels rising, but we're also seeing storms, including storms that form in the ocean, becoming more frequent and much more intense. So when we combine those phenomena with a degraded or lost coral reef, islands such as all of these island nations in the Central and South Pacific become incredibly vulnerable to really serious flooding. And this is a film, actually, The Island President, about a former president of the Maldives and his quest to secure a home for the people of his country as large areas become just uninhabitable because of this ocean flooding. So I mentioned degraded or lost reefs there. And I'm sure it's no surprise to many of you that reefs globally are undergoing massive declines. And we've lost really the majority of the world's coral reefs. But how and why is this happening? So when we look first at local threats, so regional scale threats to coral reefs, there are a lot of different threats that can cause the decline of reefs, including things like pollution, for example, runoff of chemicals from land, physical damage like boat landings, and coral disease can also cause decline on a regional scale. And a really pertinent example of these local threats comes from the dredging of the Port of Miami in 2015, shown here. So obviously the clearing of the benthos, the seafloor, caused physical damage, but that also caused this huge sediment plume, which effectively just buried a lot of corals in sediment. And it also unearthed microbes from the sediment. And this was thought to be the origin of the worst coral disease outbreak on record, known as Stony coral tissue loss disease. If anyone's heard of this epidemic, it's now spread throughout Florida and even to the Bahamas and other areas of the Caribbean. So these local threats can have a big impact. But globally, the largest threat to coral reefs and the largest cause of death is climate change. So as well as causing sea temperatures to gradually rise, with climate change, we're seeing temperatures becoming way more variable. So we're seeing these large and unpredictable spikes in temperature, which can cause, which are heat waves. And this can happen on land and also in the water, where warm water will really just sit on an area for an extended period of time. And these high temperatures can cause coral bleaching, where corals effectively spit out or lose those algae that live in their tissue and provide them with food. And this renders them colorless. So what we're seeing here is that our bleached corals, where you're able to just see the coral's bare skeleton underneath their tissue. And if temperatures stay warm long enough, then corals can't recover their algae. They can't recover and they effectively starve. There's a really fantastic documentary that I think is still available on Netflix called Chasing Coral, which documented the most widespread and intense marine heat wave on record. And this happened across the Pacific in 2016 and 17. And this documentary captured amazing footage of a huge coral bleaching event in the Pacific during this heat wave. And they also documented this amazing multicolored fluorescence of corals as they became stressed and unfortunately died. So it is amazing footage and quite morbidly beautiful. So if climate change and rising temperatures is such a big issue for corals, what are we doing about it? So this image here for reference just shows the global average temperature from the 1980s to present day. So what are we doing about this problem? So the Paris Agreement is an agreement between these 195 countries in an effort to limit their emissions, to limit the amount of warming that the planet sees to 2 degrees, but ideally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's often said that that tackling climate change is the biggest challenge that humanity has ever and maybe even will ever face. But we've actually never been in a better position to try and tackle this problem. We've got more resources at our fingertips now than we ever have, and more understanding. And I want to give you an idea of some of these solutions today, and hopefully end on a hopeful note. So how do we limit warming? So it's likely that the best solution is twofold and will involve reducing our emissions, so reducing what we're putting into the atmosphere, while simultaneously protecting carbon sinks, so natural environments that absorb those emissions. And in terms of reducing our emissions, the most important change that really needs to happen is a shift away from fossil fuel energy to cleaner forms of energy. And what really makes me hopeful in terms of this problem is that a lot of the technology that we need to address this actually already exists. And if you're interested in some of these technologies, then Project Drawdown is a really fantastic website that goes into a lot of these technologies and how we can immediately put a lot of them into play. So let's be optimistic and say in some dream world that tomorrow global emissions are reduced to 0. The oceans will still continue to warm for a while after that. So as coral biologists, what can we do to bridge that gap? How can we bridge that time lag and try and help some corals survive whilst we tackle the climate crisis? So this is where the original title for this talk came from, Brilliance in Their Darkest Hour, in reference to some of these incredibly creative solutions being trialed all over the world to try and secure some future for the world's coral reefs. So I'm going to talk about some of these solutions and interventions now. The most widespread form of coral intervention conservation is by restoring reefs using coral nurseries. And this has been going on actually for decades and is now happening all over the world. And it's a similar idea to gardeners taking cuttings of plants, where we can take a clipping of a coral colony and grow that clipping on a structure suspended in the water column, such as these PVC pipe sort of Christmas tree-like structures. And once these fragments grow large enough, we can then plant them back onto the reef by thereby just increasing the amount of coral on a reef. But you might quite rightly ask, okay, we can make more corals to put on reefs, but won't these corals just be vulnerable to the very same things that are killing other corals and that killed the corals that were there before them? So how can we make sure that we're planting corals that are more resistant to these threats? Well, if we select the most resistant corals and take clippings from those, then maybe we can create reefs that are more resistant. And this is a similar selection process that's given us modern day crops and dog breeds, for example. We could even relocate corals. So if we were to take corals from warm reefs and use them to restore reefs in cooler locations, when these cool reefs warm under climate change, maybe those corals will survive better. Now, what if we were to take this one step further and intervene in the sexual reproduction of corals? So a lot of research is going on in this regard. So we can actually collect these sperm and egg pink bundles from corals by putting these nets over them when they spawn at night to collect these little pink bundles. And what we can do is choose who breeds with who. So we can collect sperm and egg from chosen coral colonies. We can even take this one step further and use liquid nitrogen to flash freeze coral sperm and transport it to a different location and use it to fertilize coral eggs at a different reef. So once these eggs are fertilized, these larvae will then just settle on anything like a ceramic tile shown here, with each of these little orange-brown specks being a single coral larva. And these tiles can then be placed on the reef, and hopefully some of them will grow into coral colonies. So far, all of these interventions have really focused on the coral animal itself. But I just want to take a really brief detour into the world actually of therapeutic medicine. So in the last few decades, the medical community has got a much better understanding of the huge importance of our microbiomes, all of the microbes that we're associated with, the huge role that those microbes play on our overall health. And changing certain microbes, such as gut microbes, is now used to treat not only gastrointestinal diseases, but also lung diseases and neurodegenerative diseases. So what if we take that lesson from therapeutic medicine and consider not just the coral animal, but all of these microbes that it's associated with? Can we change any of these microbes to improve the health or survival of the coral? So the most obvious candidate for this is these single-celled algae that photosynthesize and that are lost during coral bleaching. So when and if corals recover from bleaching, they often do so by hosting different types of these algae, and often recovering with algae that are actually more heat tolerant. So we can replicate this process in the lab by exposing corals to warm waters, causing them to bleach, and then allowing them to recover with these more heat tolerant algae, which is a process known as stress hardening, making corals hardier with just a non-lethal amount of stress. But in terms of how practical this kind of technique is, it's hard to imagine how we can scale this up to, say, the level of a whole coral reef. We can't exactly bring a whole coral reef into the lab and bleach it. So my previous research at the University of Miami actually addressed this very problem. So what I did is used this nifty underwater cordless power drill to actually drill out these small cores from coral colonies, such as the one shown here. It's great, actually. Divers had to previously use drills with these cords that had to go all the way to the surface. So these cordless jobs made this process a lot easier. So once I brought these cores back into the lab, I put them in warm water to bleach them, and then let them recover with these more heat tolerant algae, which are shown here as these tiny little brown specks that this coral is recovering with. So after they had fully recovered, I then put them back onto the reef, into the very holes that I took them from, and over a matter of months allowed them to heal back into their colonies, as a way to try and spread these heat tolerant algae through the reef at a larger scale. So now at the University of Victoria with Professor Julia Baum, my research addresses similar questions, but at a very different site. So one of our field sites is in the Republic of Kiribati on Christmas Island in the Central Pacific, where this backdrop picture was taken. And I mentioned earlier this huge marine heat wave in 2016 and 17 in the Pacific that just decimated coral populations with that amazing fluorescence captured on film. So that very heat wave actually killed about 90% of the corals on Christmas Island, which is devastating, but also begs the question of how on earth did this 10% survive this really, really intense heat wave? How did they survive these incredibly harsh conditions? You can see here the reef before the heat wave and after the heat wave, with just, I can only see one lonely little coral colony that has survived. So with this lucky 10%, what we're now trying to work out is, did these surviving corals have a different type of algae in them, or did they have other microbes that were different, such as bacteria? And if they did have different microbes, can we use these microbes and somehow administer them to other corals using probiotics? Can we administer these microbes and make other corals more climate resistant? Right, so the final category of interventions that I wanted to talk about today is actually not linked to modifying the coral itself, but linked to modifying the coral's environment. So most trials in this arena have been done on the Great Barrier Reef. So one example of these sorts of interventions involves something called cloud brightening, which involves using jet engines to shoot tiny, tiny particles of seawater into the air, which causes clouds to form. And these clouds can, to a degree, shade the reef from the sun's heat during, say, a heat wave. And similarly, there have been trials of using a crop duster type method to lay down a really, really thin layer of chalk or limestone on the layer of the ocean, again, to try and shade areas of the reef. But I would say of all interventions, these environmental interventions, there's still a fair amount of research that needs to go into these before they can be scaled up. So I've given you hopefully a taste of really just the sheer range of different solutions that are at our fingertips. But as I'm sure comes as no surprise, there is no silver bullet. It's really unlikely that any one of these interventions will be able to secure the future of a large number of the world's coral reefs. But it's also really important here to remember that without reductions in emissions, all of these interventions are redundant, really. Having said that, personally, I'm really hopeful about a future for coral reefs, but largely that will depend on our response to climate change in the coming years. So thank you so much for listening. I wanted to give a few resources here in case you're interested in learning more about the research that I've talked about. So my current lab here in Victoria is with Professor Julia Baum at the Baum lab. And that previous research in Miami was with Professor Andrew Baker in the Coral Reef Futures Lab. And you can find my contact details on both those websites. I'm also on Twitter. And finally, there's a fantastic documentary called Reef Rescue, which is should be available on CBC. And that goes into more detail about some of these interventions and features both of these professors, among others. So I highly recommend that. And I would really love to hear any questions. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Daisy. Yes, there are a couple of questions on the chat so far. From Michael Rogers. Is there any indication that corals are migrating to cooler regions?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And actually, at the northern limits, latitudinal limits of coral reefs, often, including here on the west coast, coral reefs' northern limit is often the southern limit of kelp forests. And what has been seen in multiple different sites is that kelp forests are unfortunately being lost at their southern boundary. And that is actually allowing coral reefs to slowly move further north. However, unfortunately, it's really unlikely that that corals will recover their populations through that method, mainly because of the amount of sunlight. So as we move towards the poles, the intensity of sunlight is much lower, and corals really need their algae to be able to photosynthesize and use the sun's energy at a higher rate. So they're not quite able to survive those higher latitudes.
Right. And another question from Eleanor McKinnon. When you put the samples into the lab, their recovery period in the lab, is that in the warmer or cooler water?
Fantastic question again. So if corals were kept at very warm temperatures, they unfortunately just wouldn't survive. They would starve and die. They wouldn't be able to recover. So after that initial exposure to hot temperatures, we bring the temperature back down again so that they can recover.
Right. A comment from Mike Wyeth saying he checked that Reef Rescue is available on CBC Gems.
Fantastic, thank you.
Are you on?
And let's see,
come
Rand
here?
Harrison. Did the Miami Harbor dredging destroy most or all of the many patch reefs in the Florida Reef Tract?
Great question. So the dredging and the sediment plume was fairly localized to the Miami area, but that disease, unfortunately, has absolutely ravaged a huge amount of the Florida Reef Tract. And what's especially unfortunate about this disease is that it affects. Oh, sorry, was there a question there?
Oh, there's somebody talking.
Okay.
Well, yeah, the disease has absolutely ravaged Florida, unfortunately. It just causes the coral tissue to just slough off, to just fall off the skeleton. It's really fast acting, unfortunately. So hopefully we won't see too much more spread of that, but time will tell.
And another question from Ken Gibbard. What about ocean acidification? Is that a major problem, and are there any ways to compensate?
Absolutely, that's a fantastic point. As you mentioned, yes, the ocean is becoming more acidic under climate change, and that's especially a problem for creatures like corals that lay down a calcium carbonate skeleton, because limestone is basic, so dissolves in acid. And what that means for corals and for coral health is that it costs them a huge amount more energy to create their skeleton when conditions are acidic. So that really has a knock-on effect for their overall health. If their energy reserves are depleted, they can become quite sickly.
Right.
Oh, and in terms of ways to compensate, an intervention that's been suggested by in Australia, I'm not sure if it's been trialed yet, but there have definitely been suggestions to try and change the acidity of areas of the Great Barrier Reef.
How would they do that?
I think they've talked about adding chalk type chemicals into the water. But obviously, again, the problem is scale. To try and scale that to a large area is really hard to imagine how that could work.
Right. Another comment here from Diana Hardacker. If we're all probably asking what we can do to mitigate climate change to help the corals. Two important things we can do is campaign for climate leaders in government and eat a plant-based diet.
Fantastic points.
Anyone else with a question? If you want to just turn your mic on, you can ask it directly if you like.
Just wondering what the situation was like as far as the sea urchins that were attacking the Great Barrier Reef. Has it settled down? I know there was a lot of intervention there to get rid of the predators as well. So it's another threat, right?
Absolutely, that's a fantastic point. I believe you're referring to the crown of thorns starfish, which are these really gnarly looking spiky starfish that their populations, they go through these incredible booms and their populations can just explode, and they eat coral, so they can be a really big problem. And there have definitely been efforts in Australia and elsewhere in the Pacific, which is where this problem is the worst. There have definitely been efforts to try and, just scoop up or to get divers to collect these starfish. But that's one of those those local threats that can really just add to the problem. So they are definitely, yes, I agree, definitely in the list of problems.
Is it getting better, or was it like, was there this huge spike that has sort of settled back down again, or is it sort of an ongoing issue? I know there was a program where they were showing different ways that they were combating. I think they were even spreading some kind of chemical to make the starfish infertile and things like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think they were spreading some kind of contraceptive to try and turn the I think, are they starfish or are they sea urchins? I think they're, yeah, I think you're right. I think they're starfish. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
They're in the same group, but yeah. Anyway, I just wondered whether that was an issue on Christmas Island and other places in the Pacific, or just more specific to the Great Barrier Reef.
I think they are definitely an issue in other places in the Pacific, but I generally hear about the most from the Great Barrier Reef. But I suspect part of that is just the fact that the Great Barrier Reef is really the most heavily managed reef in the world, so receives a lot of attention.
Yeah, for good reason. Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else? So it sounds like no more questions. So with that, I will thank Daisy very much for the excellent presentation, very clear and concise. And if anybody has any other questions, I think your email was available, it seems to me, on the Uvic website.
Yes, it is, absolutely.
Yeah. So,
thank you, Daisy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm the person you ran into at the pavilion in the park the other day.
Oh, great. Well, I'm so glad you made it. Thanks for coming.
We enjoyed it. It was good.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for taking the time to do the presentation. It's always good to have those parts of our world that are rarely seen by most, have someone advocating for them.
Well, yeah, it was my absolute pleasure. Thanks very much.
So a bunch of thank yous and coming in on the chat. So I could when it gets recorded, I can send you the whole chat message if you like.
Fantastic.
So I'll just let people chime in there for a bit. And sign off. So thank you very much again, Daisy. And,
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
right.
All right. Take care now.
Good night.
Maybe we'll see you in the cold waters of off Victoria sometime.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've got to get my dry suit and then definitely.
Yeah, you definitely need a dry suit.
I've been swimming in the ocean in Chemainus for many years now, and every year it gets warmer. And this year I swam there April 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, and I was not the only one swimming. The oceans are definitely warming.
Hmm.
Yeah, not good. Nice for
Well-
swimming, but not good for the critters.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Okay, I'm ending it now.